What is going on, everybody? We are going to do a seppuku, or harakiri. More or less a sacrifice tutorial slash challenge. I've been enjoying these, so let's bang out a good one. I'm going to try to go in this with the mentality of this is aimed for the more advanced audience, since I've made a couple for the beginners and intermediates. With that being said, good luck. It is white to move. I'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The piece that commits the sacrifice is the first rook to e8. Black has only one move it's forced. It's to capture the rook with their own on e8, and that's when you can come in with your second rook, capture theirs, and finish the job for checkmate. It is white to move. We'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. Queen comes into e7, checking the black king, forcing him to move right to g8. Once the king is no longer protecting the e8 square, you can sacrifice the queen by checking the black king on e8. The black rook will come in, capture the queen, and that's when you can bring your rook and capture their rook on e8 for checkmate. White to move, give you 3 seconds. 1, 2, and 3. Proper move is a rook capture knight on f8, forcing the king to capture. Once the king is on f8, you bring your bishop to c5, check. Regardless of what square the black king chooses to go to, you pick up the black rook on b4. White to move, give you 3 seconds to pause. 3, 2, and 1. This wouldn't be complete if it weren't for some other mate. Knight h6 check. King goes to the corner. It's not going to go to f8 because queen f7 checkmate. Once it's in the corner, you sacrifice the queen on g8. The rook has to come in. Since the king can't capture the queen, it's covered by the knight. And then you got knight f7, smother checkmate. White to move, give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The queen is the one to sacrifice this round, capturing the pawn on g6. That's check. King has no square to escape to, and has one piece to capture the queen. It's the h-pawn. Once the queen has vanished off the board, you can take your bishop, recapture the g6 pawn for checkmate. White to move, give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The queen sacrifices by capturing the knight on c8, checking the black king. It's forced to capture with the queen, so that allows you to bring your knight into e7, forking the king and queen with check. Even if black tries their hardest, you can go ahead and capture the queen, and the knight will get away scot-free. Even if it attempts to hunt down the knight, there's no way to capture it, and it will escape. It is white to move. I'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. Queen captures the rook on h7, forcing the king to recapture. Then we can slide our rook on f4 to h4 check. Black does have a piece they can temporarily block. That's putting the queen on h5, but your rook on h4 can just capture the queen on h5 for checkmate. White to play. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. Rook sacrifices on h6, check. Must recapture with the pawn. Once the pawn captures your rook on h6, you can bring your queen, capture the rook on g8 for checkmate. White to move, give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. First move is queen to h7, check. King's forced to f8. Then you bring your queen to h8, check. They must capture with the bishop. Once the bishop has captured your queen, you bring in your rook on h1 to h8 for checkmate. White to move. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. Proper move is sacrificing the knight on f7. If the king just chooses to run and the rook doesn't capture, and the king goes g7, then you have rook e7 checkmate. So the rook is forced to capture the knight, and then you have rook e8 check. The rook will block on f8, and then rook capture rook on f8, checkmate. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. Proper move is rook h8 check. Forces the king to capture the rook. Then you do this backwards maneuver with the queen to h1 check. King's only move is g8, and then you can come in queen h7, checkmate. It is white to move. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. This is a double sacrifice. First, the rook will go to h8, checking the black king, forcing the king to capture the rook. Then you bring your rook that's on e1 and slide it to h1, checking the black king again. Black king has no pieces to block, and it only has one square to escape to, which is g8. Then you take your second rook and you sacrifice that one as well on h8, forcing the king yet again to consume that rook on the corner. Then you can bring your queen over to h1, checking the black king again, forcing the king for the third time to go to g8, and that's when you can put the queen on h7 for checkmate. It is white to move. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 3, 2, and 1. I always count forward. I don't know why I just counted backwards. The kamikaze piece this round is the knight. Knight capture f6 with check. It doesn't matter if the queen captures, the pawn captures. If the knight gets captured, then it's queen capture h7 checkmate. And if they don't accept the sacrifice and the king just runs to the corner, then it still is queen h7 checkmate. It's white to move. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The suicidal piece does not come in with the first move this time. The knight goes to e7 with check, forcing the king to the corner. Once the king is in the corner, then the suicidal queen sacrifices on h7, forcing the king to capture the queen. Then you may take the rook and slide it to h3 for the checkmate, since the knight and the black pawn on g7 form a barrier. White to move. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The queen sacrifices on d8, checking the king. The king has no escape square, so he is drawn in to capture the queen on d8. Then you can take your bishop and bring it to g5, double checking the king. Now the king has 2 options. If the king goes to e8, then you can bring your rook to d8 for checkmate. If the king slides out to c7, then you have bishop d8 checkmate. White to move, give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 3, 2, and 1. There's only one move, which is a forced checkmate, and that is knight e7, double check with the knight and bishop. The king is then forced to the corner. From there, you can jump the knight to g6, checking the king. Since the bishop cuts off the escape square, they must capture your knight with the pawn on h7. Once that happens, they're opened up on the flank, and you can move your queen to h3 for check. And they may have pieces to block, such as the queen, and that's when you go ahead and capture them for checkmate. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. This is a checkmate in 4. Queen sacrifices on g7. The only move black has is to capture with the rook. Once they capture the rook, you bring your first rook to e8, checking the king. They must block with their rook. Then you can capture their rook with your rook. And when the king recaptures on g8, you can bring your last rook up to e8 for checkmate. That's a nice one, isn't it? It is white to move. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. Sacrifices off the bat here with rook to h8. The king can't evade because then that would be rook g8 checkmate, so the bishop has to capture. Once the bishop captures, you can bring your queen to h4 with check. It can't dodge with the king because queen h8 would be checkmate, so it's got to block with the queen. It's not going to block on h5 because that would be a free queen. So when it blocks on h6, you can take your other rook and sacrifice that one for the bishop. That's 2 trades now that you got the, you were down the exchange. And the king will capture the rook and you will get the queen. If the king just dodged, then it would be checkmate. So, king capture rook, queen capture queen check. King dodges, and you will have a winning endgame. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The proper move is bishop capture h6. You're more or less threatening to move the bishop to capture their bishop with check, and then bring the rook to the corner. So if they try capturing the bishop with either their bishop or rook, same result. You capture with the rook, check, and after they capture the second time, the queen comes in and checks, forcing the king to g8. Then you can bring the rook to f4. f5 also works, threatening rook g4. If they capture it with the knight, queen g7 checkmate. If they move the knight at all, it's checkmate. And if they try doing anything else, bringing any other piece in, you have rook g4 check, and now they must block with the knight, and then you have queen capture on g7 checkmate. The only other option that they have, then capturing the bishop, is moving the king. If they move the king, you capture the bishop. If they capture the bishop from here, you have rook h8 check. If they block with the rook, you bring your queen to h6 check. h7 also works. If they block with the rook, check, forcing the king to e8. Queen capture g8 checkmate. Or instead of blocking with the knight, if they just try running to e8 with the king, then you have rook capture rook check. They must block with the knight now. Then you have queen capture knight checkmate. It's technically a sacrifice, and it's comical. That's why I'm throwing it in. And I need 21 seconds to cap it at 15 minutes. White to move, give you 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Pawn promotion. Queen takes queen, queen takes queen, rook take rook, rook take rook, rook take rook, rook take rook. Ba-bow. 21.